So we kind of, I don't think we've actually like fully kind of went in about burr right now, or about burr since we've started this video. But um, actually, I was doing research and I read somewhere like a line that really like resonated with me, and it was, I'm gonna butcher it. It was something along the line of like, sharpening is really just the act of forming a burr on one side of the blade, flipping it over, and polishing it off with progressively finer stones. That's kind of like embodies what you have to do when you sharpen. Would you agree with that? Would you not agree with that?
Well, so think about what makes a knife feel dull. What would motivate someone to feel? So what motivates you feeling like you need to sharpen your knives is, oh, my knives feel dull. Okay, so what does that mean? And I'll do some crude illustrations on some bright pink post-its for everybody to kind of hopefully see
Yeah.
what I'm talking about, and you can incorporate these if you want. So in a perfect world, we're talking about a 50-50 edge that looks something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that's the side of the blade. Your angle is that, and again, that's like a little visual you can use for people. What happens usually is that, and I kind of drew this in my drawing, is you'll get these little micro chips in the edge because it's so fine, and it's actually easier to use my fingers for this analogy because think of this as like a long edge. If I can get all my fingers to be the same, that would be easier. But this is your edge, like it's angled similar to this, and as you kind of use your knife, you won't be able to see these chips, but they're tiny chips, and those chips, again, think of it like that almost. You know what I mean? And those chips, because they're these standalone little, like think of it as like my middle finger here. My middle finger is a chip. There's space on either side of it. It doesn't have enough structure to stand on its own. And so what it will do is it will curl. And so all of a sudden I have these like little curls in these curled little microchips in my edge. It's not to say that, and every knife is different, right? Like it's not to say that your entire knife is curled to the left. That's not the case when you're saying my knife is dull. It's a case of you have these little microchips. There's maybe certain sections of the blade where it doesn't come to a completely pointed bevel that can cut through something and feels sharp. And you'll feel this too as you're cutting through certain things. You'll feel the blade catch in certain places, and when it really catches, like that's a bad chip. And what ultimately causes long-term harm to knives is if you don't go in and sharpen, and you're just consistently honing and honing and honing and honing on a honing rod, you develop this thing that's kind of like this weird amalgamation of curled chips, and that's what you're cutting with. And as those get worse and worse and worse, like that's when chips end up happening, and that's when you can really ruin a knife. So envision that the burr, like the curled edge looks like something like that, where it's like there's a little thing that's kind of just flipped up, and the way that feels is dull. Like the way that expresses itself in how it feels on a cutting board or when you're working with food is dullness. So when you're reshaping a edge in the sense of putting this piece of metal on a rock, right? You're trying to grind those little microchips that have curled away. You're trying to, and this shows with like the mud that you'll sometimes see, quote unquote, like the steel that ends up getting dissolved in the water, and not necessarily dissolved, it's more like dispersed in the water, right? So it's like you have these little tiny pieces of steel in the water that you use on your whetstone. And so what's happening when you kind of like put this up against a stone, and I'm going to try to get it to focus not on my face. There we go. So you'll push this up, and it's really wanting to focus on my face, huh? You'll push this on one side, and because it's on either side of the knife, when you do it on one side, you're kind of like pushing, and now all of it's on this side, and you'll feel it if you kind of run your thumb up, and it's like the ridges of your fingerprint is where you will feel them as you run your finger up. So for example, if I'm working with this knife, and so I'm going to, for sake of this video, I have the side with the logo on it and the side with no logo on it. So if my logo side is the one that's being pressed up against the stone, as I'm sharpening, that's going to flip the burr up on the non-logo side of this knife. So as I take that knife up and off the stone, I can run the prints of the ridges of my fingerprint up along. So I'm kind of like, I'm not swiping my finger into the knife. I'm kind of going from the side of the knife down, and you'll feel what feels like a little ridge on that side on that of the knife. That's your burr. And so what you're ultimately wanting to do then is flip the knife over, because now you have this, but picture the mirror image of it, and you're wanting to do it again. So you're wanting to remove that. And what you're trying to get back to is my original illustration of like that sharp, clean, there aren't any little microchips or, like I said, little burrs going on. And
so by destroying sort of everything, pushing everything to one side will allow you to kind of start from scratch by flipping the knife and polishing that away, progressively working up to finer grit stones and getting it finer and finer, keeping things consistent and even so that it's razor sharp.
That's very well said. And that's exactly what you're trying to do, from the sense of kicking it up on one side and then on the other side and then on the other side. And as you can see by my Post-it drawing, once you get to the point where you're actually working the edge, all those microchips have been worked away. And so you'll get to a point where you don't feel a burr anymore. And so I think you and I have spoken in previous conversations about, like, you're not actually looking for a burr on your 3,000 grit or 6,000 grit stones if you're working higher and higher. Reasons you're working on polishing, right? Like, it's almost a different style. Like, you're doing something different on the higher grit stones versus trying to work up a burr.
Same exact movement and technique. The pressure is dramatically decreased, and you're almost like, it's this weird thing that you just develop with doing it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a finesse thing. I sound like an idiot to saying this, but it's like true.
No,
you know what I mean?
Totally true. And the thing that I want people to also keep in mind is there's this common misconception that it's not even a misconception because it's technically true, is that, you can do 1,000 grit on a knife and it can feel sharp. I think you and I have spoken about this, Adam.
Right.
What you're actually working with on your first bunch of chives or your first head of cabbage that you're cutting is, if you've just done your 1,000 grit stone, it's a pretty coarse grit. Like, it's not coarse, but it's not fine either. And so you have these little, like, it looks like that. Like, it's not perfectly straight. It's like just like that. That's what happens when you do your 1,000 grit stone. And so what you're working with is a micro serrated chef knife. That sounds terrifying. Like, don't like, if someone's gonna do that, could hurt me. Like,
a micro serrated chef's, and it's like a saw.
But that's the thing though, is that, like, if you're gonna tell someone that they need to do a hack slasher movie with something like that, like, you could really hurt someone with that. And it's the same with working with food. Like, you could really tear up some prep with that. And that's great. But as we mentioned, like, these little serrations, if anybody's ever worked with like a bread knife, and, like, my mom was like stereotype of this. She would use a bread knife for everything because it's like, it feels sharp. Like, it can bite into food. Yeah. The problem with that is a bread knife, you can use a bread knife for a year and it won't feel dull because those serrations are so exaggerated. When we're talking about these micro serrations in a chef knife, those, like we talked about, exactly like that. Those micro serrations in a chef knife, they don't have the structure to hold up to that pressure of cutting through a head of cabbage or butternut squash or radishes or whatever you're cutting. And so because they don't have the structure, those start to curl. And so you'll have people who say, like, oh, well, I just use 1,000 grit stone, or I use my 400 grit diamond steel honing rod, and I can get a great edge, quote unquote, back on my knife. And it's like, congratulations, you've made a micro serrated chef knife. It's going to feel sharp for the next 10 minutes. But after that, all those little teeth are going to curl over. They're going to feel really dull, and then you're going to have to do it again. Kind of.
You're just going to be chasing that edge, man.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, it's like, I hate to tell people, like, because people will insist, I'm getting it sharp. And in a sense, you are, if we're defining sharp as being able to cut through something with ease, without a lot of pressure. because that's, you know, technically you're right, like it's true, but at the same token, it's like if you really want to build a long lasting edge, you have to think about some of these other things that we're talking